Okay, well, we can get started. Thank you all for making the time to attend our second in a series of webinars to collaboratively develop a Motus network across the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. This is a collaborative effort run by Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and partners. And today you actually have 4 hosts for the webinar. Myself, my name is Correll, Matt Webb, Erin Strasser, and Erin Youngberg. If I can get this to go forward. All right, here we go. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Motus team at Bird Conservancy, we've got Matt Webb. Matt Webb is an avian ecologist, but he is also heading up our collaborative Motus effort to really create a web of Motus stations across the Great Plains. Erin Youngberg is his right-hand woman, serving as a Motus technician and Jill of all trades. So really kind of helping us fill in the gaps where we need help. And, you know, team morale is also one of her strengths. Erin Strasser is an avian ecologist and is heading up our efforts to develop the Motus network in northern Mexico, and has also been collaborating with partners on getting, generally speaking, in Latin America, a Motus network up and running. Brant Ryder is our chief conservation scientist at Bird Conservancy and is also a bird tagging nerd. So he's helping us with some of the finer points of Motus station installation and as well as bird tagging. And finally, myself, I'm Correll. I'm the research director at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and I'm also the full annual cycle team lead, where we focus on conservation of grassland birds across Canada, the US, and Mexico. So here's our overall outline for our webinar today. Erin Youngberg will go over some quick webinar housekeeping with us. I will then remind everybody for our overarching program goals. Then Matt and Erin Strasser will give us a recap of our first set of webinars. And then we'll kind of dive into spatial prioritization of stations and hopefully kind of have a productive conversation there. We'll then move into discussing upcoming funding opportunities. And finally, we wanted to kind of talk about strategy for communicating between collaborators after this webinar. And finally, part of the feedback that we got after webinar 1 was to allow more time for question and answer. So we've allowed ample time for that this time around. All right, so Erin Youngberg, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Mo. Yeah, just a couple of housekeeping things. With these Zoom meetings, I think we're getting pretty good at this, but just some reminders that if you have any questions or comments, to put them in the chat. And a lot of those questions can be answered as we go along, but we'll also try to get to those at the end. And please remember to keep yourself muted until those discussion pieces that Mo mentioned. And also turn on your video if you're able to, because we want to see your face. And I want to remind people that this webinar is being recorded for those of you that can only attend a portion of it, or for people that can't attend today. And a reminder too that the first English and Spanish webinars that Mo mentioned are also recorded and available if you want to watch those. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Youngberg. Okay, so just a quick reminder of why we all are here. At Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, we're really focused on conservation of grassland birds in the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. And this is probably not news to many people, but grassland birds are in steep decline. And we know this after a variety of sources over many years have really reported that in some way, shape, or form. But you know, most recently, this was reported in Rosenberg et al. 2019, 3 billion birds lost paper. Grassland birds were the guild that was exhibiting the most steep declines since 1970, with an overall 53% population loss across that guild. Now, grassland birds in the northern Great Plains, the ones that are showing this very steep decline, are actually kind of congregate in 2 different areas. During the breeding season, they congregate in the northern Great Plains, and you can see that on the heat map here on the right side of our screen. But then during the non-breeding season, many of them move down to the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico and the southwestern US during the non-breeding season. So really understanding what's going on for grassland birds in these 2 regions across their full annual cycle is really important for their conservation. Now, many of you probably also know that there's a lot of information gaps when it comes to grassland birds. They have been pretty well studied during the breeding season, although there are, of course, you know, efforts that we could still do during the breeding season. However, you know, knowledge on exactly what is driving this decline is a little bit more lacking during the non-breeding season, specifically during migration. We really don't know where grassland birds are going during migration, or if their habitat preferences change during migration, and the paths that they take, as well as the timing that they're exhibiting during that time. And then also, we really don't have a very firm handle on within season movement for these species. So how often are they moving within the non-breeding or breeding season, and what is driving that movement? So specifically, we're focused on where do grassland birds go during migration, but grassland bird movement, generally speaking, is something somewhere where we could really learn a lot more. Again, with the end goal of working towards grassland bird conservation as soon as possible. So to this effect, we've started working to develop a Motus network across the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. You can see those heat maps that I showed on the previous map here, but now these black dots show the existing Motus network in North and South America. You can see that a lot of the concentration is occurring in the Northeast right here, especially along the Atlantic coast, and also some development down here as well. However, the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert region, both during the breeding season for grassland birds and the non-breeding season for grassland birds, is not well developed as far as the Motus network is concerned. So what we're hoping to do is really kind of develop a Motus network through deploying stations and tags on grassland birds within this geography. And you can see that kind of outlined in the light purple here. We're calling it the Great Plains / Chihuahuan Desert, or GPCD region. And as you can see, you know, especially compared to the Northeast, it's pretty, you know, devoid of Motus stations. And so we're really hoping to change that with this effort, again, to fill those information gaps about where grassland birds are going during migration, when they're doing it, and then how much they're moving within seasons once they get to their destinations. So the goals for today's webinar, generally speaking, are to have a productive discussion about spatial planning for Motus stations in the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. We'd also really like to come out of this with the formation of at least 2 working groups for funding opportunities that are coming up in the next couple of years. We also want to have, again, a fruitful discussion about a strategy for communication after this webinar is complete with our partners that are attending today and others as Motus gains momentum. And finally, all Motus technical questions answered by Matt Webb. And of course, that's an overstatement, but we at least want to give people ample time to ask questions of Matt Webb and any of the other people here that have expertise in this particular technology to really get those conversations going, get some questions answered, and also create points of contact for people as they move forward in their Motus journeys. And with that, I can hand this over to Matt Webb and Erin Strasser, who will be hosting the rest of this webinar.
Thank you, Mo. Let me try to share my screen here. All right. So I just wanted to kind of give a quick recap of webinar 1, which happened back in September, a couple months ago. It seems like forever ago, but that's 2020 for you. So during webinar 1, we went over what Motus is and how it's used, essentially. Stu McKenzie from Birds Canada did a really good presentation describing what Motus is and how it's used in research for birds and other animals such as bats and insects. Then we started up in the northeastern United States and worked our way out west here, hearing from people who are leading the regional Motus development efforts in all of these areas. We heard from Lisa Kijik from Willistown Conservation Trust, leading the Northeast Motus collaboration going on out there. We heard from Sarah Kendrick from state of Missouri, leading the efforts in the Midwest. We then heard from William Blake from MPG Ranch in Montana, talking about what he's doing in the Intermountain West. And then we ended that with Mary Whitfield from Southern Sierra Research Station, discussing and describing some of the efforts along the Pacific coast, as well as her working group within Partners in Flight Western Working Group to develop Motus throughout the West here. And then I described our plans here at Bird Conservancy for a Motus network in the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. And we ended the webinar by giving you some homework. One part of it was what we're called the KML project. And we also asked for locations of stations that you might have planned. That KML project was, we asked you for a shapefile, a KML file, showing the research area where you may be doing research within the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. And from that, we created a heat map. The heat map was a little bit underwhelming because it showed the entire region was important, but it showed one single hotspot kind of in southeastern Colorado, northern Texas, New Mexico sort of area. It was just one red dot. Otherwise, it was a big yellow blob across the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert. So I'll hand it over to Erin Strasser, who will talk about the Spanish language webinar.
Hello. Yeah, so just a couple weeks ago, the very end of October, we held a webinar in Spanish to talk about Motus in Latin America. This was organized by Julian Garcia Walther, and he's from Pronatura Noroeste and the University of South Carolina. And it was a really great webinar. It was mostly in Spanish or with subtitles, and there were over 150 attendees from mostly Mexico, South America, Central America, and then some US attendees as well. So it was a really good opportunity to talk about the basics of Motus, some of the planned networks like Julian is planning on the western coast of Mexico, our project in the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert, and then also get really great perspective from other researchers who have been using Motus in Latin America, in particular researchers from Selva. Their work in Colombia, it gave us some really great insight into how to do this kind of project in Mexico. I really appreciated some of the ingenious ideas that they had, for example, using bamboo poles as masts to mount their antennas in the jungle. Although that's a great idea, I don't expect that to work in any of these grasslands. But again, this is available to watch. You can find it on Pronatura Noroeste's Facebook page if you would like to watch that.
Great, and thank you, Erin. I also forgot to mention that our first webinar is available to watch on Bird Conservancy's YouTube channel. So now we'll hear from Erin Youngberg regarding some of the input that we got from participants from that first webinar about research that's going on within the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert region.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thanks to all the folks who sent their shapefiles or KMLs of their research areas. And based on what I received, I just have a quick recap on, like Matt said, on the current research interests across the GPCD. And a few that were outside, but we included them anyways. So just to give everybody an idea of what each other's doing, if you're not up on that yet. So where the shorebird movement, stopover, and migration research is happening, we've got Birds Canada doing some shorebird movement research in Vancouver and wanting to expand a Motus network there on the West Coast. We've got folks with Environment Canada doing shorebird migration and stopover research in Saskatchewan. There's also the Central California Coast JV or joint venture would love to facilitate Motus expansion on the California coast, even though that is outside of the GPCD region, still important for shorebirds. David Coons is also interested in stations in the coastal California estuaries. TNC in Arizona and southern Arizona is interested in shorebird movements across that US-Mexico border and down at the Colorado River Delta area. And then Pronatura Noroeste is working on that Motus network that Erin mentioned in coastal Mexico. And then in Puerto Rico, way over there on the east, Damaris Colon Molina is interested in shorebird migration and stopover ecology as well. And then when we get to grassland breeding and within season movement research, And there's some overlap with partners studying breeding as well as migration, but we've got partners with Canadian Wildlife Service and Environment Canada working in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, monitoring grassland birds, specifically hornlark and chestnut collared longspur. Andy Boyce with SCBI is tagging Sprague's pipits and chestnut collared longspur in Montana. University of Colorado student Allison Pierce is working with Mike Wonder on mountain plover migration from Colorado area. Tim O'Connell from Oklahoma State University and his students are studying several grassland bird species that span from the western edge of the forest biome to the high plains. And they have an idea to develop Motus with mesonet stations across the state of Oklahoma. Courtney Ducard, his student, is studying grassland birds in the Thunder Basin of Wyoming with lark bunting, mountain plover, loggerhead shrike, grasshopper sparrows, lots of grassland birds there. And Jeremy Ross has also planned station installs in the Kiowa Rita Blanca National Grasslands of Northeast New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle. And then Alice Boyle has been doing grasshopper sparrow research in the Conser Prairie for several years, but most of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska were interest areas of research for her for all grassland bird movement. And then also continuing with the bird migration and stopover research that's happening. Bird Conservancy has been monitoring grassland birds in Colorado and the Northern Great Plains. Like Mo mentioned, that full annual cycle research of Baird sparrows and grasshopper sparrows. We also have a partner, David Swanson, the University of South Dakota, researching grassland bird breeding strategies there. And then also down in the Kiowa and Rita Blanca National Grasslands, Kristen Warren is the wildlife biologist there, interested in hosting some stations for grassland coverage there with the Motus network. And then Russell Martin in the Texas Panhandle is interested in monitoring grassland birds as ecosystem indicators. And then finally, with the winter bird movement and survival research that's happening, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has been studying grassland bird survival and monitoring there as well. Again, Baird sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, and Sprague's pipits, as well as monitoring grassland birds in several GPCAs in the Chihuahuan Desert. Francisco Puente has several grassland bird research sites in the Chihuahuan Desert. We've got a partner at Sul Ross University. Mike has study sites for grassland birds in both Alpine, Texas, and in northern Mexico. EPCIT, I hope I'm saying that right. EPCIT is monitoring grassland birds in the southern Chihuahua Desert as well. And we've got some partners in Audubon and Arizona interested in researching wintering grassland birds, as well as neotropical migrant stopover sites in southern Arizona. So they're looking for funding to put a station there at what's called the Appleton-Whittle Research Ranch. And then there was a couple of other species that people are using Motus for. Anna Diaz is researching swallow species movements in Saskatchewan. The MPG Ranch has several study species and other genera besides birds, Lewis's woodpecker and brown-headed cowbird, things like that. David Swanson at the University of South Dakota is interested in studying woodland bird migration through the Great Plains River corridors in South Dakota. David Borre and Pro Natura Noroeste is working on a Motus network throughout the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico. And then Gita Bodner with TNC has several sites of interest in grasslands of Arizona and would have contacts who may be able to host some station sites there. So it sounds like southern Arizona and that Texas Panhandle, northern New Mexico area is some hot spots for sure for some Motus networking too. So that is the recap of all of the exciting research people are doing.
Awesome, thank you. So it looks like a lot is going on in the region and the edges of this region. So we'll move to our first big topic for the day. And before I get into this, I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions or anything, any concerns or anything that they wanted to bring up before we get started. I'm having a hard time seeing any of the faces or anything. So I'll open it up.
There's a quick question here in the chat. Would it be possible to get a comprehensive list of names, locations, species, and research activity to facilitate connections and collaborations with this group? And I would say yes, absolutely. I can send that out.
Yeah, and at the end, towards the end of this webinar, we'll be discussing communication and collaboration and kind of how we're going to be going, going forward doing that. So there might be a way that we can share some of that stuff on there as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And fill it out, because we know that there are some other partners that aren't included on that list. So
yeah, we're learning about more stuff going on all the time.
You guys are all awesome.
All right, I'll move on. We'll get started just talking about spatial planning for the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert Motus network within this region. So I want to give a recap of what our research questions are for grassland birds, our vision for Motus within the region here. I'm going to give you a rough timeline for installation of the stations that we currently have funded here in this region. And we'll show you an internal spatial planning map that we've been using just on our team here to map things that are going on nearby and also try to make decisions about where we should place our stations. And so we'll kind of end this section with that. Throughout, you'll hear also from Erin Strasser talking about a lot of our research questions and specific spatial planning things for the Chihuahuan Desert into Mexico. So just a quick recap of what our research questions are, our vision for this. You can see the area over there with the range map of the Baird sparrow. We're interested in where do grassland birds go during migration? What kinds of stopover locations do they use? What sorts of habitats do they use as well during migration? Mo talked a little bit more about these at the beginning. We're also, interested in migratory connectivity of grassland birds throughout this entire region and some very specific within season movement questions. And most of these questions, like Mo said, result from knowledge gaps in grassland bird ecology. And a lot of these questions will be best answered with a grid of stations across the landscape. But to begin with, a sufficient grid may not be initially feasible, and it's something that we can work towards. So here's Erin to tell you about some of the things, one of those very specific project questions.
hi guys. Yeah, so I just want to give an example of a type of research project that we're thinking about using Motus to answer some of these key questions on grassland birds. And so a proposal that we recently submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act grant program involves using Motus to research the winter demographics and the movements of Sprague's pipits and thick-billed longspurs. And so this project would involve initially 2 distinct sites. One that would be run by the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León, the UANL, and another with the Universidad Juárez del Estado de Durango. And so these would be 2 very distinct sites in the grasslands of Mexico. We'd be working with partners such as ProNatura to get additional stations up in this area. And Matt, if you want to go on to the next slide. And specific, some of the specific questions and goals that we have relate to getting a better grasp of winter demographics, specifically winter survival and immigration. And so the goals of this project are to get 3 to 4 stations installed at new sites. This is separate from other Motus stations that we already have funding for, and we'll talk about locations for those in a little bit. But essentially, we'll try to get up 3 to 4 stations at 2 distinct sites, and then tag wintering birds thick-billed longspurs and Sprague's pipits, with Motus compatible transmitters that can then be detected automatically with the Motus stations, but then also we'll have crews manually tracking these birds. And the reason we want to do this is because we really need to distinguish between survival and immigration. It turns out grassland birds move quite a bit throughout their life cycle. And on the wintering grounds, we found with data from Baird's and grasshopper sparrows and Sprague's pipits that these species can move quite a bit. And it's really challenging to get accurate winter survival estimates because those estimates are also capturing these high rates of immigration and low rates of site persistence. And so we want to use Motus as well as on the ground tracking to locate birds, determine their survival status, and then also have the ability to collect data, vegetation data, and other environmental covariate data from those sites where the birds were actually using habitat. Now, the other goal of this project is to answer questions on longer distance movements within the season, within winter. And so with stations that we will already have installed by the time we get this project going, COVID hopefully doesn't interfere with that too much. We'll have a series of stations throughout Chihuahua, throughout the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico, as well as by then many stations in the US and Canada. And so we're hoping to be able to capture these long distance within season movements on the wintering grounds because we truly don't know how much time birds spend at these sites. Are birds simply there for a couple weeks, a couple days, or are they there all winter? Why would they leave a site or why would they persist? And then we also want to get at connectivity. And so with this larger scale Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert network, this is something that we hope to get at by tagging these two species. Of course, these aren't the only two species that we intend on tagging over the course of this project. We have a lot of questions related to Baird's and grasshopper sparrows, which are two species that we've worked with for many, many years.
All right, thank you. So I want to show you this map. This is a grid of stations. In an ideal world, this is what the Motus network in the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert would look like. It's pretty ridiculous, but this is a grid of stations placed 30 miles apart, and there's about 1,500. This is absolutely ridiculous and will never happen, but this is kind of where we started our planning effort from. This is a screenshot from our Google Maps that I'll show you here in a minute, but because we described, some of these specific questions and needing to have a grid to answer them, this is where we started at. And I wanted to show you it now just because it is so ridiculous and unnecessary. We can do a lot better with many fewer stations. So that's what we're going to talk about now. I want to give you a quick timeline, very general timeline of how, of when we plan on doing this work of installing these stations, depending on COVID, of course. That's thrown a wrench into our plans already this year, and we're not sure how much longer that's going to be taking place. So 2020, this is where we're at right now, the start of the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert Motus network development. We're starting with some initial funding from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Neotrop grant, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act grant. We obtained funding from those early on, and as well as some small contracts, one particular from the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. And it brought together enough funding for 34 Motus stations throughout this region to begin with. Part of this early development will be planning webinars such as this one you were on and the previous one, so that we can work as a large group throughout this region, to develop this network in a way that will best suit all of the research that's going on within the region. Early next year, we hope to have locations chosen for these stations, in particular the 34 stations, and have installations begin. So in 2020, despite COVID, we were able to install 4 stations in this region, 2 here in northern Colorado and 2 in central Kansas. We have plans, specific locations planned, and we're working on permissions and all of those for an additional 4 stations. 8 of these stations funded by that NMBCA grant, the Neotrop, are slated for installation in the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. And that leaves us 18 stations to be placed in the Great Plains portion of this region. So 2021 to 22, you know, we hope to be able to install those 18 stations and then the 8 in Mexico. We hope to be able to hold some Motus workshops, and ideally these would be in person because there's a lot of potential for hands-on learning to take place at these workshops, but they can be done virtually if needed. We're going to kind of hold off and wait and see what happens. Part of that initial funding also supported the purchase of roughly about 200 tags to be placed on grassland birds to be able to start answering some of the research questions that we're interested in. So over this exact same time frame, we'll be approaching more funding opportunities as they come up to fill in this Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert Motus network, both in the northern Great Plains and in the Chihuahuan Desert. And we don't really know, we haven't really talked about an ideal end date for when this network will be completed, but
It'll never end.
Never.
It'll never end. We hope to have the station installs continue on through 2023 into 2024, and fill out this network in such a way that the research questions can be adequately answered by them within that time frame. We'll continue to install stations developing this network, as well as tagging grassland birds throughout this time frame. So the big question is, how are we going to get there? How are we going to do this? And to answer that, I want to take you back in time and look at what took place in the northeastern United States. 2017 really does seem like it was ages and ages ago. It was only 3 years ago, but at that time, I was working for the Carnegie Museum of Natural History's Powder Mill Nature Reserve. I was based in Pittsburgh. Our reserve was about 50 miles east of Pittsburgh. And we had gotten involved in just some very specific local questions that we decided we could answer with Motus. Some research questions that we were working on. So in 2017, we'd been working with Motus for the better part of a year. And this is what the Motus network looked like at the end of June in 2017. You could see that in the inland area, we were really the only stations in the entire Northeast. So I'm going to fast forward 2 more months. At the end of August, this is what it looked like. There was this fence line placed from across the entire state of Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia up to Erie, Pennsylvania. And it looks like this just popped up out of nowhere and quickly came online, but it was the result of over 6 months of work preparing for the installs, contacting property owners, getting permissions, all sorts of things. This was the work done by Willistown Conservation Trust, who now heads up the entire Northeast Motus collaboration. And this fence line was built with funding that they had cobbled together from many different sources. Pulling in state money as well as foundational money to be able to install these 30 stations across the state. Once this was installed, we became involved with them, what they were doing, and their efforts to expand the Motus network in Pennsylvania outward, and make it so that we fill in the entire state of Pennsylvania a little bit better, but also include Motus stations in the nearby states. So this is what it looked like 1 year later, at the beginning of December in 2018. We had started to fill in the network in southwestern Pennsylvania to further answer some of the questions we were interested in. But some of the installations moved out of Pennsylvania down into Maryland and into Delaware as well. We began filling in those states. In this time frame, sometime, Northeast Motus Collaboration received a competitive state wildlife grant, which is a grant we'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about funding. But essentially it's a multi-state conservation grant that funds work going on across several states. So 1 year later, on December 1st of 2019, this is what the network looked like. We filled out Pennsylvania quite well. I say we, but I didn't work for them anymore at this time. I was here in Colorado. But the installations actually started going up into New York, filled out Maryland quite well, and Delaware as well. So we'll look at what the network looks like in the Northeast currently. So this is 7 days ago, a week ago, the network looked like this. They had finished their first competitive state wildlife grant, filling out a couple stations up in upstate New York, and developing a few more within Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the goal is to build a loose grid within the state, as well as down in Maryland and Delaware, which are a bit easier. And they recently were approved for a second state wildlife grant, competitive state wildlife grant, to build the network up into New England, further to the Northeast. So a couple of years from now, this entire Northeastern United States, New England, will be filled out in a similar kind of manner. So I like to show this as an example, because what they did was they pulled together many partners who were interested in Motus, interested in researching birds using Motus in this region. And everybody worked together to come up with, how can we do this? How can we best answer our questions that we're interested in? Where should the stations be placed? Do you have properties that we could, even place stations on? And they really work together as a collaborative to get this done. And I like that as an example of what we're able to potentially do out here. And just as they started somewhere with the fence line across the state of Pennsylvania, we have to start somewhere too. So we have these 18 stations that we need to place. And so I'm gonna bring you to our Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert Motus planning map, which is a Google map that we use internally here. So this is it. We're all fairly familiar with this map. If you looked at the Motus website, this is all of the current Motus stations throughout North America. And as of, I think it was November 5th, so a couple weeks ago, I have placed our Great Plains and Chihuahua Desert ridiculous grid over this as well, just to see what that might look like, but we'll shut that off because it's ridiculous. In order to start understanding where we need to focus our specific efforts, it's important to understand where grasslands still exist. So a lot of the reason for declines of grassland birds is because grasslands simply have been converted into agriculture or other kinds of uses. So where do grasslands still exist within the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert? So I'll turn on this layer, which is the Grassland Priority Conservation Areas, or GPCAs. I think there's 59 of them throughout this continent, so the three different nations, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And these are places that lots of researchers have identified as important for conservation of existing grassland plots or remaining large tracts of grassland. So having that on the map is kind of nice. We talked about our planned stations, the 4 that we have planned, and those are here in northern Colorado. You saw some pop up in Montana as well, and that's a different project. Scott Summershoe's working up there. But our 4 stations are planned right here. To the east of us, these purple lines that I just popped up on here are the rough ideal plans for the Midwestern Migration Network headed by Sarah Kendrick. She told you about that at our last webinar. So it's nice to have those on here to see how things might connect in the future. And I'll turn on the Intermountain West stations that are headed by William Blake at MPG Ranch out here to the west of us. So now we can start plopping some points down on the map here. And we've kind of decided based on that, the heat map and based on the input that we've got from webinar 1, that this area here, bordering, the north and south, bordering the north and south of the state of Kansas, coming into Colorado, down into New Mexico, and up into Nebraska is where we want to initially focus our efforts with these 18 stations. You can see a lot of these stations that we plot down here fall within some of these existing GPCAs. Others fall on specific research areas that partners are interested in. So Alice Boyle is a partner of ours. I can't remember where she's from right now. I'm sorry, Alice. Out in Kansas, working on the Kanza tallgrass prairie. And so that's one of the points that we plotted here. I have a station placed out there. And you can see on this map that Sarah Kendrick has begun filling in some of these lines already here in Missouri. And so our lines that we plopped kind of connect these to what we've got planned here in northern Colorado as well. So following the Kansas-Nebraska border and following her southern line across the Kansas-Oklahoma border up into Colorado. And then it gets a little bit non-linear out here at the end of in Colorado. And that's because some of these areas are of particular interest to researchers. So there's a point where a lot of mountain plovers and other grassland birds like to gather in the fall right up here. There's also this point within the mountains, there's these mountain parks that we've got some reason to believe grassland birds use. So one of our planned points is in North Park here in Colorado. This southern one is in the San Luis Valley, which is a large valley in southern Colorado that has a lot of existing grassland within it. So I will, this is what we're working from. And in the chat box, if you would like to give us some input on this, we can also discuss this at the end of the webinar as well. These exact locations have not been determined. The points themselves are just numbered. But once we kind of decide on roughly these two lines, these two rough lines, we can work out particulars of where they would be. So I'm going to hand it back over to Erin Strasser, who will talk about the work down in Mexico.
Can I just add one thing, Matt? Thank you so much.
Yep.
If we do, looking at those stations placed, and when we open it up for discussion, some of the stations that are moving into the mountains are based on geolocator data that we have from birds and grasshopper sparrows. We had an effort we put out over 200 geolocators on birds and grasshopper sparrows in 2016 and 17, but we were only able to recover, I believe, 12 functioning units that recorded information, and only a subset of those recorded enough information to create a heat map for where they were traveling. But it did show a lot of traffic in the western part of Colorado, and so that's part of why we're trying to extend those lines into that area, is to understand a little bit more what birds and grasshopper sparrows might be doing that could be surprising to us and outside of normally understood grassland areas.
Yeah. Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about our plans to deploy stations in the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands in Mexico. I can touch a little bit on some ideas for crossing over into the US as well. But I'm particularly talking about funding that we have from the US Fish and Wildlife Service for these 8 stations in Mexico. And I want to make it clear that these stations are going to be dual mode, so they'll function with low tech and CTT transmitters. We haven't decided yet which type of transmitters we're going to be using on our target species, but they will be dual mode stations that have 4 antennas, covering the 4 cardinal directions. So these 8 stations, we're going to be deploying these with various partners in the region. We have a number of partners that work closely with private landowners and have been conducting bird surveys, restoration projects, management projects. And so we're going to work very closely with these partners to get these stations up and running and maintained. And so we're relying a lot on discussions with these partners and their knowledge of the area, because the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands are a very different world from much of the Great Plains. And I think most of the people on the call here spend a lot more time in the Great Plains. And so they're used to more open, vast areas, which is a little different from the Chihuahuan Desert, which is much more patchier. And so the process that we're going to take to identify locations for these stations is going to involve first, targeting the GPCAs, the Grassland Priority Conservation Areas in Mexico. Within those GPCAs, we're then going to use remote sensing information such as the Inneji grassland layer, as well as on-the-ground knowledge and, of course, information on access and safety to then determine the best locations for these grasslands. Next slide, please. So the grasslands in the Chihuahuan Desert are, only making up around 10% of this really enormous area. There are a lot of other types of habitats in the Chihuahuan Desert. And the spatial distribution of these desert grasslands is really discontinuous. The grasslands are somewhat patchy, and this is because of a lot of topography in the region, mountain ranges. Also, differences in the amount of precipitation, as well as differences in soil type, really impact the type of grasslands in the region, as well as where they're located. And they're also found along a really broad elevational gradient. And that, of course, this region is facing a lot of threats, primarily due to conversion to agriculture. But there's also issues with mismanaged grazing, drought, shrub encroachment, and these are all contributing to this increased fragmentation of grasslands. So although it's a really huge area where the Chihuahuan Desert is a really huge area, we're going to have to really target the location of these stations to make sure that they're in the type of habitat where we'll actually locate grassland birds. So this is just one example picture. Matt, if you want to go to the next slide. You can see some more, and the scale there on the bottom, that's 30 miles. And I know everything looks kind of brown when you look at it, but that's not all grasslands down there. You've got these little patches separated by mountain ranges, separated by areas that were formerly grasslands and are now irrigated agriculture. Next slide, please. And then there are some instances where we find our focal species, our grassland birds, in these kind of out of the way grasslands, sort of like what Mo mentioned regarding Baird's and grasshopper sparrow use of these parks, is what we call them here in Colorado, these kind of valley grassland areas surrounded by the Rocky Mountains. So down in Mexico, I'll just point out one example, interesting example of Baird sparrows using relatively small areas of grasslands that are outside the range of these already identified grassland priority conservation areas. So this is a Baird sparrow, and this lovely picture was taken by our partner, Jose Hugo Martinez Guerrero. And in fact, all of the beautiful bird pictures that you'll see in my presentations are from him. In fact, my presentations would be really ugly if it wasn't for Jose Hugo. Anyway, so this little Baird sparrow and many of its friends have been found up in an area like this pictured up in the Sierra Madre in these patchy grasslands surrounded by pine trees, sharing habitat with an endangered endemic species, the Sierra Madre sparrow. And so we do want to get stations in locations like these, because this isn't a region that's captured by any non-breeding wintering grassland bird transects that have been conducted. And so we want to make sure that we're going to capture all of the grassland locations where focal species may be spending time, because we want to ensure that we can provide the right information to manage these areas appropriately. And so this is just one example. Next, please. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to be really, really important that these stations are in locations that are accessible and safe, and they're also making the most impact, as well as solidifying partnerships and allowing the program, the Motus grassland program, to grow. And so an example pictured here, this is my beloved second home at Rancho El Uno in northern Chihuahua in the Janos GPCA. And so this is one example of just a great location for a Motus station. We have existing research projects here working with monitoring, as well as measuring winter survival. And there are a number of other ranches such as these in the Chihuahuan Desert where partners like Pro Natura, Noreste, IMC Vida Silvestre are working with landowners. And so these are the type of locations that we intend to target within grasslands that we identify. And so Matt, if you want to then pull up the map and we can kind of take a look at what that looks like down in the Chihuahuan Desert. And all of these locations that we've dropped the points for, they're not there. There they are. There's some of them. That one. Great. So these locations that we've identified, these are not set in stone. We still have a lot of work to do, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. But essentially, these locations are based upon existing grasslands or areas that we're looking to understand a little bit more about grassland bird habitat use and survival. For example, those 2 points that you see down right over the word Durango to the west of where the little hand is, right there. So those are 2 locations down in a laguna in Durango that are locations that are intended to capture locations of wintering spragues, pipits, and thick-billed longspurs, but also potentially a lot of waterfowl and shorebirds that use the area. And so the yellow polygons that you see, those are the GPCAs. And so we're targeting areas within these GPCAs, but we know that there are grasslands beyond them, and there's potential for expansion of these existing GPCAs as well as addition of new GPCAs. So again, these are at locations that are on ranches where we have partners that have worked closely on these properties, and that we can ensure there will be a presence to ensure that nothing happens to the stations, that they can be checked upon, and where we have field crews actively tagging grassland birds. So there'll be a lot of movement of these stations. These aren't set in stone, and we're really hoping to get a lot more stations in this region, not necessarily just in grasslands, but in areas that are adjoining grasslands or that are maybe not thought of as traditional grassland bird habitat. All right, money.
All right, so we're running a little short on time, so we'll kind of, maybe we can touch on some of the aspects of each of these opportunities we want to highlight. So we'll discuss the idea of funding right now. So first one that I want to talk about is these competitive state wildlife grants. These are monies that are available from the federal government for states, so multiple states to bring to come together to partner on work that is that's identified within their state wildlife action plans. So these action plans, every state finished them by 2005, and these identify the species of greatest concern within each of the stations and identify some of the specific work that needs to be done to work towards the conservation of those species. So with a CSWIG, we have to have buy-in from several partner states. There might be an RFP coming, request for proposals coming in January. We're not sure yet with COVID and with everything going on. At least last year, they were up to about $1 million for all of the states to work together. So there's potential for large portions of money to fill out the Motus network. And we luckily have Northeast Motus as a really successful precedent with their 2 CSWIGs that they've been able to get. Their first was about $500,000 and their second one was just under $1 million to develop the Motus network in the Northeast. There's the website for it, and Erin will talk about some further funding opportunities. You might be muted, Erin.
My God, quarter 2020, you're muted. Yep. So since I just wasted 30 seconds, great. But I'm trying to, I want to go over this a little bit quickly because there are ample resources on these funding opportunities online, but I just want to point out these opportunities and how we can use these to fund more Motus-based research to understand grassland bird movements, demographics, limiting factors, connectivity, all of the important stuff. And so two of the big ones that provide a lot of funding, primarily for, especially for work in Latin America through the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, as well as the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. These are 2 just great sources of funds through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're both pretty competitive, but are great opportunities to get funding for larger scale projects that are going to provide the right kind of information to then manage habitat appropriately for grassland, well, any migratory bird, but in our case, grassland and wetland associated species. Next, please, Matt. So the first Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, which is the NMBCA, or we'll throw around the word Neotrop. This is a big grant that is announced annually and awarded annually, due in early November. In fact, we just submitted the project that I mentioned a few weeks ago. It is around up to $200,000 for 1 to 2 year projects. It has heavy match requirements, and I'll talk a little bit about match so everyone's clear on what that is. And like I mentioned, a lot of this funding is going to projects in Latin America. And there is a specific program that targets a list of threatened migrants, and there are several grassland species that are within that list, shorebirds as well. And so take a look at the web page that is right here. We can share that in the chat as well. But all the information you need is there, and the resources on that site, as well as reaching out directly to the contacts on those web pages, will answer a lot of those questions. And of course, I'm happy to talk about my experience and other people on this webinar who have applied for this, as well as the next slide, funding opportunity, I'm sure would be happy to talk about their experience. And so I don't personally have experience applying to the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, but I view this as a really promising opportunity to get fundings to expand the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert Motus network throughout Canada, the US, and Mexico. There are standard grants for all 3 countries, as well as a small grant for the US. And it's specifically, the grants are to increase bird populations of wetland habitat via activities under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And that does include mention of upland habitat surrounding wetlands, which I'll mention an example of a type of situation where we have that. So again, the website is right there to look into that. I really think this is a great opportunity for us to pursue perhaps multiple proposals, one for Canada, one for Mexico, and one for the US. But I think there's a lot of promise here. We see grassland birds utilizing habitat surrounding important wetlands in Mexico, and we have evidence from tracking juvenile birds and grasshopper sparrows that they will move towards wetlands. And of course, we know there are other species like chestnut-colored longspurs that stop at watering holes along the way. So here are the grant deadlines, also available on that website, but you can see that there are some coming up here in the next few months, which we know will go really quickly. And so this is what I'm thinking for that NACA grant, which is that I think there's this unique opportunity to combine research and conservation efforts on birds that are utilizing wetlands and the surrounding upland habitat. So there's this list of wetlands of international importance, and this document was just published here on the 11th of November, and it includes a list of wetlands of international importance under this Ramsar title, and essentially there are these priority wetland locations that are used as stopover wintering sites for shorebirds and waterfowl and definitely grassland birds. But we really don't have much information at all about how grassland birds are using these wetlands. How long are they staying there? Is it just a quick stopover site where there's a great food sources, but isn't maybe necessarily the best cover from predators or thermal refugia? We really don't know. And so in this most recent proposal to the NMBCA, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, we proposed to install stations around a laguna, the Laguna de Santiago. And this is a basin in Durango, Mexico. And this is one of those sites that I think will be really key in understanding Sprague's pipit and thick-billed longspur winter survival movements, and then also will lend some great data to within season movements and then connectivity. And so I want us all to think about how we can come up with proposals that are including not just grassland birds, but are going to lend value to wetland species, and then also possibly western forest migrants that are passing through the Sierra Madre, where there are grassland patches used by species like Barred sparrows. So I think there's a lot of potential for overlap across these different guilds, and NACA is one funding opportunity where we could get money to do this. And I just want to touch a little bit on matching funds, because not everyone understands exactly what these are, and they're really important for sharing costs across different groups, and then also adding value to projects and getting buy-in from different partners. And so, just briefly, match are there's two different kinds, and so we've got in-kind match and cash match. In-kind match is generally these non-cash contributions that are lending value to a project and showing buy-in. These can be value of services, IT services, property purchases for conservation purposes, salaries of partner organizations, funds that were used for technical assistance or management on a property. While cash match is directly cash from a partner organization, or say cash that say Bird Conservancy brought in already to help fund research at a specific site. And so you can be really creative with the type of match that you can come up with. An example is, what's the cost to run the electricity to a Motus station for over the course of a 2-year monitoring period? Say that's $1,000. Well, that's in-kind match that a partner organization could donate if they were willing to take on that cost of electricity. You can get really creative with match, and I think there's a lot of room for discussion on this, but it's something everybody can think about and a way for everyone to contribute. Now, be aware that there are very strict rules on how match can be used. Specifically, it can be used only once. And then for each type of grant, whether it's federal or, through, Disney or some foundation, they're going to be different requirements. So you do have to be really aware of those requirements and make sure to not misuse match. But just think of it as a really powerful tool, and think of ways that you can contribute in kind or cash match to a project. And here at Bird Conservancy, we also have the ability to contribute match. Our partners in Mexico at UANL and UHED, for example, have contributed match in the form of salaries for monitoring projects we've done. They've brought in funding from Mexican federal sources, which then we can use as match for our US federal sources. So there's lots of opportunities, and I think everyone should keep that in mind. And so speaking of some of the opportunities in Mexico, some of the funding that we've pursued and used in the past with our partners at UANL, UHED, as well as some other groups, some other university groups, have been through CONACYT, the Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología. And there are some opportunities, and we don't have dates announced for these yet, but essentially funding to help with collaborative networks, collaborative projects that are benefiting students and universities and nonprofits. So that's a cool example that can provide support for a large scale project like this Motus network in the Chihuahuan Desert. There's also CONACYT funding opportunities to support student theses, and part of that, the Sprague's Pipit and thick build monitoring project that I brought up, we do intend on bringing on master's and PhD students to answer their own questions, and also to act as those on the ground, Motus experts that know how to maintain the stations on site. And then locally within the different states of Mexico, there are state government funding opportunities. A number of foundations that are out there that we could pursue as a group, such as Disney Conservation Fund, the Wilberforce Foundation, which I know has a focal region down in the Southwest, in kind of the Sky Islands region, which again, the Sky Islands are surrounded by grasslands in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. So there could be some opportunities there that we could look into.
Great, thank you, Erin. Before we go any further, I would like to open it up for discussion. I'm going to pull up this map that I showed you earlier, this spatial planning map, and I want to open it up for discussion about this. Let's talk about if you guys have any input or questions about where we have plans, both down in Mexico as well as here in the United States. All of these blue and purple markers are easily moved. So I heard there was some talk in the chat box. Erin Youngberg, maybe you can, do you have any questions or any specific things that were brought up? I can't see the chat box very well from where I'm at.
No, there was one question about what the area east of Santa Fe was, but that's I believe the Kiowa Rita Blanca National Grasslands, perhaps that somebody was asking about. And then just suggestions of maybe, would it be worth looking into just sort of Las Vegas, New Mexico, kind of just south of that San Luis Valley in Colorado? Do we want to kind of put some points in there too, if we think birds might be headed that direction? Those are really kind of the only two questions / comments that I saw about that map specifically, but jump in if people have other ideas.
Robert Penner also said that he had some folks interested in installing Motus stations in Southeast Kansas, which is where we currently have some of the points. So Robert, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but I think these are exactly the kind of discussions that will be helpful to have and keep having, is if stations are already planned somewhere, that's great. And I know at least with our funding, as long as we're getting at stopover and migratory ecology for grassland birds, where we actually put our stations is very flexible. So if there's stations going in somewhere, we really want to know about them, especially near those two planned lines, so we can, combine resources.
Well, yeah, this is Robert Penner. I actually have a professor from Pittsburgh State University, which is located in the southeast part of Kansas, that is interested in establishing them towers. So those 2 points kind of down there in the southeast part of Kansas would be something they'd be interested in. So I'd like to get them connected to, I guess, Matt to talk about that. And then the other question is, I actually have somebody in the northwest corner of Kansas that might be interested. So I wonder if we could move one of those little icons down to the from Nebraska down, if that would still work. Because that is my question. I mean, I probably have a few folks that may not be right in line with what you proposed. So I assume you're still interested in Motus towers in other parts of Kansas.
Yeah, absolutely. These lines, like I said, are very, very flexible. I can, move a point like that. They don't mean anything specifically. Yeah. But also you could see that, other places where people have done lines, like Sarah Kendrick out here in Missouri, her line is not a specifically perfect line either. We use where we have access to. So, when it comes to the time to actually place these and to figure out the specific locations, that's when input would, be very, very helpful about specific locations. You might have partners who have access or who would be willing to grant access to place a station. So yeah, that's really good. And that is something that we can discuss, Robert.
Okay, great.
Somebody mentioned that Sarah is also raising her hand. Sarah, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this incredible workshop. It's very, very helpful. And it's kind of just to say that I'm professor for the University of Guadalajara here in Western Mexico. And I think that I have the potential to establish Motus towers. And of course, I feel a little behind because I wasn't in the all three workshops, but I know that you sent recently where I can see all the workshops that were recorded. But I would like to have the list of birds for partners that would like to collaborate in Western forest. I mainly work in this site that is a mountain site, and we have two types of a main ecosystem. I mean, we have 14 forest types, but dividing like in the temperate pine oak, pine, cloud forest, and oak forest, and also tropical deciduous forest. So I think it's really, really nice. All the information that you already gave us. So thanks, and I'm willing to collaborate, and I think I have the potential. And of course, right now I don't have like the time, but I would like to start to develop an agenda to start collaborating with somebody that is interested in these mountains and specific in Western forest birds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kathy Granillo had a question. Or Granillo, sorry.
Granillo, por favor. So I have a question and a comment, and it's sort of from a selfish point of view and a biological point of view. Those grasslands, so I'm at Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge in central New Mexico there. And we also are host a long-term ecological research site here on the refuge, the Sevieta LTER. And we have not been grazed in over 40 years. And I'm thinking that, so I'm looking at some of these ungrazed grasslands like Sevier or like kind of a mixture of grazing regimes down at the LTER in southern New Mexico, the Hornado LTER, and they're kind of in between. They're both in between your edge of the Great Plains as you show it here on this map, and kind of southeast Arizona, where we know a lot of birds go. But we, getting permissions and protection of the Motus stations would be easy on on the refuge and on the Hornado, I would think. Just ideas there.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's good input. So, these first 18 that we have to, start somewhere specifically. I know that we'll all have, very specific locations where, we all are working, or where we might think that a station would be ideal. And that's where, a discussion of funding could come in too. So we went over several, potential opportunities for funding. And one thing that I forgot to say, and I think Erin maybe forgot as well, is that we would like to start a couple working groups of sort to begin approaching or applying for some of these funding opportunities. Particularly, I'm interested in working towards one of those large-scale CSWIGs, competitive state wildlife grant. And so I would invite people to email me. I can't do a chat I can't put my thing in the chat right now. Maybe Erin or Mo could put my email address in the chat box right now. But I would invite people who might be interested throughout the entire region, throughout the Great Plains region, up in the northern Great Plains, or down here in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona area, or Kansas and Colorado, throughout everywhere, to email me who might be interested in participating in one of these competitive state wildlife grants. And what it would entail is some effort on your part, perhaps, of reaching out and pestering your local state wildlife agency to become involved and to buy into this concept. And we can take that discussion off of here specifically and do that over email, all the particulars about that. But I would like to pester people to participate with me to fill in some of these gaps. So fill in, even south of the San Luis Valley, where somebody recommended some stations go. I don't want to stop the spatial planning discussion. So if anybody else has any input on that, Matt, or questions with funding. Yep. Somebody jump in.
Can I jump in?
Oh, Andy Boyce had a question also.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Andy.
Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, my question just quickly is, basically, can any of the money that's already earmarked for these stations potentially be leveraged to, convert a larger number of stations to dual mode that are currently in, low tech only? I know, a bunch of the stations down in the, Sprague's Pivot Wintering Grounds on the Texas Gulf Coast. And, there's a ton of stations up in Saskatchewan that I know are low tech only. And yeah, just wondering if any of that cash could potentially be leveraged in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't really thought about that much. The idea of converting a station is almost like starting from new with the installation, taking it down and putting new antennas onto it and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot involved in that, but that is definitely something we could discuss. And of course it would be involving the people who manage and maintain those stations down there along the Gulf Coast to do that. But yeah, I mean, that is something we could totally discuss.
But really, I mean, ideally, any stations that we put up here within the GPCD, we should aim to be dual mode from the get-go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we want to be as inclusive as possible. We can't say which tags which group is going to use, and so ideally any stations that go up are going to be dual mode from the get-go. At least the ones that Bird Conservancy specifically has funding will definitively be dual mode. And we hope that anybody else who's participating in this network would do the same.
I think all the partners and flight ones would also be dual mode.
Okay.
The Western working group.
Yeah. And then Jeremy, you had some input too.
Okay, so we had some limitations on going dual mode on some of the stations because we've been putting them on the old aero motors, the old water pumpers on national grasslands, and the 12-foot antennas on there are a little bit harder to convince the lessees to allow that. So far we haven't put up any of the big 166 megahertz antennas, but we'll select judiciously within that. But and first off, my apologies, I didn't get the KML in until this morning. So, but on the very tip of the panhandle of Oklahoma, where it meets New Mexico and Texas, we're putting a whole array of sensors out there that will operate on almost a fine scale, so that we can mark a whole bunch of birds in that Playa Lake, grassland, high plains region, and then get a sense of when they're dispersing out of that area. So there's 200,000 acres of national grassland that are available to us in the Rita Blanca Kiowa complex. And so far we have 4 stations there that have just come online. My graduate student, John Muller, who's on the call, and myself were out there putting those up. But we have permission to put up at least 10 stations in that area. So it's really going to give us really high resolution of movements. And for shorebirds, it can still apply because there are playa lakes in that area. And then looking more broadly across Oklahoma, the points that you've put in there, including the Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge, they had a tower and it seems to have gone away, but we might be able to supplement that. So just north of Enid, you can see there. And then the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, in principle, we have permission in Osage County over there east of I-35. In principle, we have permissions there as well. So filling in that line, I think is well within our wheelhouse between University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, and so we could definitely tackle that. What I'm calling a turnstile fence. I don't know if anybody's coined that term yet, but but yeah. So we're gonna and in addition, in the Rita Blanca area, we're gonna we are planning to install these nodes that cellular tracking technology also supplies. So there is the possibility of doing very fine scale movements potentially. So I just want to throw that out there for people that we're kind of approaching it as a bit of a natural laboratory, just because of the scale. It's 60 miles across, 30 miles deep, and we're gonna hopefully have 10 stations in there to get some fine scale movements.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. That's great.
I just wanted to say, so what Kathy Granillo mentioned, like the Jornada experimental range down in New Mexico. And so like thinking about a location like that, like, can we approach, whoever directs research at the Jornada and talk to them about them funding stations? What are opportunities like that we can find where we can talk to an organization that has the funding and the presence to get a station up and running? It just requires them understanding what we're trying to do and their involvement.
Okay.
Say, Matt, if I could jump in here. So I'm Jim Eckberg. I'm a researcher with General Mills, and we are working in a couple of regions on advancing regenerative agriculture practices where we source ingredients, and this is primarily winter wheat. And so we have some pilots in place in Hutchinson, Kansas area, and then Jeremy is exciting here. about Enid because we're trying to actually launch a pilot in Enid, and very excited about the fence line approach here to kind of understand at a course level, sort of, it sounds, if it's fair to say, Matt, like kind of what's coming into these really broad regions. But we're also interested in how can General Mills, through creative thinking, bring some non-federal match to support some Motus towers specifically in these areas where we're exploring effects of agricultural practices or effects of agriculture and non-grassland habitat on birds in conjunction with grasslands. So I'll keep it brief because I know there's lots of folks on the call, but really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you for the input. That's, yeah, it's great to have you on board.
David Borre has his hand raised. Do you have a question, David?
Yeah, it's related with the question that Erin asked about how we can make the link with those organizations that are conduct research, like La Jornada Ranch. Well, here in Mexico, we have two big opportunities with that. We have the INIFAP, that INIFAP is owner of several ranches across the Chihuahuan Desert, experimental ranchers. So we start talking with them, and they want to relate all the research that they are doing with livestock ranching and all agricultural research with biodiversity. So we are talking about start in La Campana Ranch in this January with some bird surveys, because they are starting a 10 years project with how to measure the carbon print of livestock. So they want to relate that with birds community. So maybe it's a chance to talk with them. The director of the INIFAP Chihuahua has been very open with us. And also he offered us to start talking with the other director of INIFAP in Coahuila, in Durango, in Zacatecas, in San Luis, and in Nuevo León, to expand the network about this process, this kind of research, link the agriculture ranching investigation that they do with birds, especially because they know the significance and the importance that grassland birds represent for grassland, no, here in the Chihuahuan Desert. And I think there is a chance, so I can start the talking with them, and maybe how they can fix their objectives and their funds, because here in Mexico they can reach some funds that are specific for them. They are not open to any other agencies in the government. They are only for them. So maybe if we can figure out how they can get advantage of the opportunity to support this. And the other is CONAFOR. CONAFOR is in charge of the name is SARMOD, is SADOMODO, SARMOD. It's a very detailed survey that they have been conducted about 5 years ago, and was supported by a GEF project with the BID, the International Development Bank, I think, American. So they basically put a station across of the country, and the principal objective was survey vegetation, bat, I think pollinators. So they conduct they got a lot of data of that survey. So maybe we can talk with them, figure out how is the situation with that survey. If the survey ends, I don't know, I think the project ends in the last year, but I don't know what are the plans of CONAFOR with this kind of survey, because they put maybe I don't know, 100 or 200 stations across the country in different ecosystems. Actually, they put some in grassland. Actually, they put in the North Coahuila and in Janos, I think. So actually, they have a very interesting data set of sounds, because they put recorders, all 24-hour recorders in all of these. So that they put it with with the purpose to identify bats. So, but maybe we can talk with them and see what the data, where is the data, and maybe we can use that data for birds too. So I can start talking with them. Actually, we are talking about different issues we can afford, and they are very interested to support this effort.
Okay.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. And of course, you know, Motus works great for bats and insect pollinators as well. So there's those opportunities too that they could be interested in. Thanks, David.
Yeah, and if they've got the infrastructure for a 24-hour recorder, you know, on site, perhaps that same infrastructure, the power source and things like that, might able to be used for installing some antennas and a receiver on too for Motus. So
yep,
there's some great opportunities there. Thank you, David. I want to I appreciate all of the discussion, and we just have a tiny bit more to cover really quick, and then we'll get into Q&A or continue the discussion.
I got all day.
Me too. I do too.
Me three.
So one last quick thing we want to discuss is this idea of communication and collaboration. So you know, how will we work together? We can't just continue having large-scale webinars like this, but you know, what methods might we be able to use to communicate? So Erin's got a couple slides here.
Yeah. So you know, I don't have anything too specific. It's more like, how do we do this? Well, I think a lot of us know how to manage collaborative efforts and work with a lot of partners, but this is a pretty big group. You know, Birds Canada has this, you know, Motus listserv that's accessible to ask general questions, understand how to, you know, ask questions about using Program R to manage data, things like that. But you know, I think there's a need for a way for all of us to communicate about joint proposals or match. Say you have this great idea for match, but you don't really know what to do with it or who needs it. How do you get that information out to other partners? Say you plan on tagging a species that somebody else is already working on as well. How do you find out that they're also working on those species? And then of course there are considerations of data sharing, and then the responsibilities of station maintenance and the costs and time that go along with that. And so as we're building this this group, and an important component of the grants that we've been awarded or have submitted for funding, an important component is making sure that we have the appropriate data sharing agreements in place, and are also getting memorandum of understanding or some kind of document in place where we are all on the same page. It's on paper, it's recorded. We know what's expected of say someone maintaining a station. We understand how the data is going to be used and shared. And so we don't have you know, MOUs in place yet. However, at Bird Conservancy, we do have data sharing agreements, but it's going to be a little bit different with Motus because it is you know, data that we all want to use to answer these important questions on grassland birds and forest birds, waterfowl, etc. So that's something that we need to talk a little bit more about, but I wanted to just get it on everybody's radar and let you know that we are thinking about this, and we realize that it's really important that the communication is there, because we can't just rely on Matt for everything, even though, look at him, he knows what he's doing. So yeah, so Matt, you want to talk about that, and then also I think we've got a slide just with the contact information for a listserv that we're hoping to use to facilitate some of the communication that we've talked about.
Yeah. So one thing along with the idea of collaboration that I think is extremely important for all of us to be on the same page about is making sure that whatever we install, whatever stations we put up, whatever networks we create, always go onto the Motus website itself, that we create a project, we deploy the stations, we follow all the things on there to ensure that our stations are working correctly within the larger network. Motus itself does not work unless we do it that way, unless we all make sure that we do our part to collaborate and participate on motus.org. So I would encourage all of you who might be installing or might be even deploying tags to explore this website in depth, motus.org. If you have stations or a network that you're deploying and it's not on there, I would encourage you to put it on there, because that way the data that you gather will be on there. You can protect it to whatever degree you need to. But if your stations pick up other people's birds, without those stations being on the Motus website, the other researchers will never know that your stations picked up those birds. And so it's really, really important for collaboration purposes that we all use the Motus website. And I can help you through that process. I know that it might seem difficult. It might seem kind of hard figuring it all out. I can help you, and the Motus team is really great with help as well. So, and then I want to also encourage, just like we talked earlier about, as we go forward and develop stations, that we really think about making them dual mode, be able to receive both of these frequencies. And there are things that we can do using smaller antennas, fewer elements on the antennas, to make them smaller, make them lighter, to be placed on more difficult structures. In fact, two of the two stations that I placed at Kansas in Cheyenne Bottoms, Robert Penner, his project out there, one of those stations is our full huge station with 4 antennas for both modes, and the other one is a smaller station. It's still dual mode, but it has 2 antennas per frequency, because it was on a much more delicate structure itself. And so there's ways we can get around problems with the giant antennas. So it's important to participate in there. And we have created this Google group. So Motus, the Motus Wildlife Tracking System has their own Google group that everybody who throughout the world who does Motus communicates on. But for our specific regional Motus network, I wanted to create a listserv somewhere we can discuss things, somewhere we can send an email introducing ourselves, talk about collaboration, talk about who's doing what where. So this might be a place that we could share information from that slide that Erin Youngberg gave earlier of who's doing what throughout this entire region. And then people can fill that in and continue that portion of the discussion going as well. So Erin or Mo might paste this link into the chat box. And if you go to this and join this group, then you'll be able to post things and all that on there. I currently have it set that you have to be a member in order to email or post anything. So I would encourage you to join that or write this down. It's a little bit of a long link, but it's not too bad. And then last, like Erin said, here's some of our team here at Bird Conservancy and our emails regarding who to contact for what. So myself for any kind of technical questions about Motus or any sort of planning or funding questions in the Great Plains in the United States. Erin Strasser for collaboration on Motus in northern Mexico and the Chihuahuan Desert and planning and funding in that same region. And Mo Correll, our team lead for large scale, maybe even continental planning and funding. And there's each of our emails, which we'll probably share in the chat box as well. Mo, Erin, Erin, do any of you have any other things before we just go right down into the question and answer period? Anything else to add into this?
Yeah, just specifically contact me if I aren't already aware of any work with Sprague's pipits and thick-billed longspurs, since those are species that we're very interested in right now. And also, if anyone's interested in working towards some funding from the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, if anyone's interested in looking into that for the US, Canada, or Mexico, talk to me and I'd be happy to help work on a proposal, any proposal. So.
Great. So with that, we're finished with our content and we'd like to open it up for the rest of the remaining time. We've got just about 20 minutes or so for any kind of question and questions you might have. Also, any further discussion on both funding and spatial planning can fit in here too. So
I see Stu had a hand up.
All right. Remember to unmute yourselves.
Caught me when I wasn't paying attention for a second. Hi, everybody. I just want to make a comment. You can hear me okay? Thumbs up, Matt? Okay. I just wanted to make a quick comment on the communication aspect. I think having that separate list is really good. There's lots of regional stuff, but I'd encourage anything of generality to push it to the Motus list. You may not think about it because you're sort of working, you might be working in your own little bubble, but there's probably 10 others that are doing the same thing or have the same question. And even though I hate saying it myself, emails are easy to delete if there's duplication. Likewise, I really applaud your efforts to coordinate so that there's not duplication, but I do want to stress the importance of duplication or repetition in the network. It could be really helpful as stations go down, you have a backup in place. So, I wouldn't stress too much about having, stations too close together or projects overlapping. And as we discussed with the diversity of station designs that are going to appear with various projects, big antennas at one site and small antennas at another, having that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. And I just want to say it's been a pure pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon, and keep up the good work. And if you ever need anything, well, I'm going to delegate to BCR in this case, but feel free to reach out to us at Motus HQ as well. So I won't need any more of your time. Thanks again.
Thanks, Stu.
Thanks, Stu.
Are there further questions in the chat box or anybody raised hands?
There was a question in the chat box that I think a lot of people are I know people wonder this quite a bit. Jim from General Mills was asking how much a station costs, and Stu had shared a link for general costs and involved in station deployment. But Matt, I didn't know if you wanted to comment any more on that, or if anybody had any follow-up questions, because costs seem to come up quite a bit as far as stations are concerned.
Yeah, we've developed a spreadsheet for an idealized Motus station, and this is one of our giant ones with 4 antennas per frequency. And in an idealized world, we would place these on some kind of existing structure, so we don't have any tower or anything like that within this cost. But our current cost for that is right about $5,300. So I think when we write it into budgets and such, we're overestimating, and we push that up to about $6,000. So that's what we would say a large scale station would cost if there's existing infrastructure that we can place it on.
And then for stations in Mexico, there are locations to source a lot of the materials in Mexico that will cut down on the costs. But one of the issues that we might run into are the really high import taxes if we're trying to ship or bring in things like the sensor stations. So that could add quite a bit to the cost of a station in Mexico. And so we're still trying to navigate how that will pan out.
Hey, I was just wondering if there was a resource available to walk folks through what sort of permitting is required on what sort of land ownership types for Motus stations. I hadn't seen that, and it might just be that I haven't found it, but curious.
Yeah, the Northeast Motus group actually has been doing some Motus workshops, some hands-on workshops. Some of them are 3 to 5 days long, depending on the content that they cover. And within those, they discuss some of what they've come up with, what they've come up against, needing permissions and permits and that kind of thing out in the Northeast. We have not developed that out here quite yet, but we will include that kind of information within a workshop that we give here. But I feel like that would be a really good document or something that we could collaboratively put together, if of specifics within the state that you're working in. I know that Pennsylvania Game Commission had some very specific permitting processes, and we found that we could fill out one form and get access to every single one of their properties throughout the state, and that was extremely helpful, rather than finding out later on after we've done that 40 or 50 times. And so yeah, a living document like that might be a really good idea, something on Google Docs. I could get something like that started and share access to it on that listserv, and anybody could add things in. That would be a really helpful thing to have.
In our experience, there hasn't been sort of a one-size-fits-all solution for permits. It really depends on each landowner. Is completely different. And some, it's a handshake. The best ones are handshakes. If you can get a handshake, get a handshake.
Now it's the elbow.
The elbow.
The COVID shake.
So it's a tough nut to crack sometimes. The one aspect that I would suggest higher level coordination on that may or may not be an issue is liability insurance. And that's one role where a large organization like BCR could take responsibility for all. I'm not putting that on BCR. Someone could take responsibility for them all on behalf of everyone. And that works differently state by state. And the insurance I'm talking about is primarily just in case a station falls on someone or a snowmobiler goes by. There's all kinds of risks, associated with what we're doing. So I just would caution not to necessarily overlook that. Universities may have to handle it differently. And generally it's not too expensive, at least in Canada, maybe $30 a station per year. But anyway, there's things that are worth coordinating at a high level, and there's things that you just get bogged down.
Yeah, one of the things I was just thinking that might be valuable to coordinate at a high level in the Great Plains is the issues with sage grouse. I know up in the NGP, a lot of our areas are sort of core sage grouse habitat, and there's some really restrictive restrictions for putting vertical things up in that habitat, and having backing from a large collaborative network to go to BLM or Fish and Wildlife or whoever with that, I think would be a big deal.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I just have a comment. This is Sarah Kendrick in Missouri. I just wanted to commend you guys. Your strategy is really great to see. And I love that you're extending the lines across the region. That's really, really great. You seem to have a really good balance between your research projects and the infrastructure, which we all know can be like a chicken and egg situation where you don't know which one to do first. And so I think that's really awesome. So just kind of like a rah-rah at the end, but we just put up our 8 southern line that you saw in the map in Missouri in time for fall migration. And we just, on the first fall migration, it was up, we got 19 detections, 15 of which are William Blake's gray catbirds or nighthawks or Swainson's thrushes that came from Montana. I was not expecting Montana birds to be picked up in Missouri, but Motus is only as strong as the investment we make in it. And so I really encourage you guys to just keep pumping as much funds as you can into this, because BCR has an amazing thing going with a great team who's able to run out there and put things up. And that's a pinch point for many people. I don't know who, but for some people. Good job, guys.
Thanks, Sarah.
keep seeing something going on in the chat box, but
They're just cheering me, Matt. That's what's happening.
I see Mike mentioned, because our partner Mike, who's been with Sol Ross, she's going to be with now the Universidad Autónoma de Chihuahua, the UACH. And so, yeah, she's asking about, is there an option for students to get involved with the stations in Chihuahua? And so my hope is that there will be a time when we can have groups of people together and we can get stations up and then go out with student groups to flush net grassland birds and tag them. And so UACH has a research ranch where Mika did some of her PhD work. And so that's one of the locations that I think would be fantastic for a station, because it would involve students and allow them to collect data that they can use for undergraduate up to graduate projects. So thanks for offering up your willingness to collaborate, Mika.
Guy also mentioned in the chat box that if you actually multiply out the 6K figure that Lisa threw out for a station, and we've also arrived at that, Lisa, is roughly what we budget for when just budgeting for station, parts. If you multiply that out across the grid for 1,495 stations, you get under $10 million. So I actually hadn't done that multiplication out, and $9 million isn't super close to our piggy bank right now, but it's, it's a number to work towards. So I thought that was a fun thing to think about.
You guys have a target now.
Double it.
we have a target, yeah.
So Matt, I would, if I could chime in, this is Scott Summers with Fish and Wildlife. I was messaging and been thinking about this with Guy Fawkes of how refuges within the Fish and Wildlife Service can help fill in some of those gaps. And like, yes, we have a station up on a refuge. Did you guys do a special use permit? Did you fill one of those out, Matt? Because I don't even know. And we're going to put them up on a couple refuges up in Montana. Like, we've gotten permission, and like, it was an easy sell to be like, yeah, we got an antenna, a radio antenna. We're not using it for anything, and it's got power on the building, and there's internet in the building. Pretty straightforward. And I think I'm going to go and take a look at at least refuges in my region here and see where it might fill in some of those gaps, if we could target some towards any of the other refuges, not just the ones up in the mountains. That would be really useful if we could do that in a couple of those in San Luis Valley, but out on the plains, whether it's Colorado or Nebraska or Montana, wherever. But just thinking, like, logistically, you can't just put them up wherever we want, or we have to be where the opportunity is. And that maybe we need to push on the refuge things. I could push on that a little bit more and see if we can identify some more places and kind of see where they might fit in filling in some of those gaps that we've identified.
Great, yeah. Back in August, I was able to do a presentation on a National Wildlife Refuge biologist phone call that they had. They had like a monthly meeting, get together and discuss what's going on in the refuges. And I was able to present about Motus and about our plans across the GPCD region. And several people have contacted me from refuges who'd be, are interested in station placement on the refuge and want to discuss that further. And I think the question always comes down to funding at that point. I had several people contact me and asked, are you, as Bird Conservancy, are you offering station to be placed on our refuge? And yeah, so I think that having that conversation should always include, how are we going to fund that in particular, because, we do have these 18 stations to be placed and, roughly planned out across these two borders, but that's not always going to be the case going forward.
Oh, yeah.
But in the
Oh,
future, when we do
yeah.
when we do some kind of large scale funding, offering up a refuge system or a network of refuges to place these will come into play. So yeah.
And I think once we get a few of these up on refuges and pick up birds, it'll be an easy sell, and maybe we can find some money to get additional stations up on other refuges down the road to build that up a little bit.
Okay.
Bosque del Apache.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you working on that, Scott. Thank you.
Well, let me know who has reached out to you and we can touch base.
Okay.
We should have a conversation about that, whether it's my region or not.
All right. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I would just also add one of the things, at least from the Arsenal perspective, is, you know, the outreach and education. Even if the tower is not somewhere where the public can go up and see it, having a little kiosk or information about it. Maybe we end up having a list of different birds that were picked up there, like the poor whale that was Matt Blake's that was picked up in Fort Collins on our station there, you know, on a refuge. Like, you know, that's a great, you know, outreach education opportunity for the kids, parents, et cetera, visiting the refuge too. So it's a total win-win. And like within the service, it's not just migratory birds, but refuges and other programs. And it's not just birds too. There's a lot of other things we could be doing with it. And so it's it was an easy sell talking to folks about putting up stations on refuges. So
cool. Yeah.
Lots to think about, lots of benefits in addition to just getting cool bird information and filling out that stuff too. So I'll shut up.
It'd be great to get some funding for some interpretive, you know, kiosks or, you know, whatever, banners or anything that helps with, if it's at a site where there are visitors, that they can read and understand what that big bunch of antennas is.
Yeah, no, we definitely want to pursue that.
Cool.
For sure.
Nice. Well, it is noon in Colorado. I know it's 2 where Mo's at out there in Massachusetts, but this is the time that we set the webinar to go to. I'd be happy to stay on here for, you know, as long as people have questions, keep going forward, but we also know people have lives beyond our webinars. And, you know, you're welcome to take off and head to whatever else you're doing. We really appreciate you participating in today and being here, and look forward to communicating with you on the listserv. And I think we're planning a webinar 3 sometime soon. We'll send out more information as we get that together. This webinar has been recorded, and again, it will show up on our Bird Conservancy YouTube channel, which we will share a link for once it's up and running. So with that, thank you from all of us. And I can answer more questions if more people have questions, or you can email me. Thanks.
Can't we make money off of a YouTube channel?